microdosing for peak performance, inverting CBD myths. And for that, I would be requesting Mr. Raghav Priyadarshani to join me here on stage. Can we have a round of applause for Mr. Priyadarshani? Come on.
Good afternoon, everybody. As we are at the fag end of 2 fabulous days, I am going to attempt to keep this presentation short, informative, and also lighthearted. So without further ado, what are we talking about this afternoon? We're talking about microdosing a macrogreen, if I can just use perhaps a reference from the previous speaker. And by macrogreen, we mean specifically the cannabis plant. On the screen in front of you, you have a blow-up. I suppose this is a hark back to a middle school botany class, biology class, just looking at the plant specifically and what the elements pertaining to the cannabis plant are. As you can see, what is blown up in this image is the specific top end, the fruiting top of the cannabis plant. And this is largely what the West is obsessed with. When I say the West, I pertain to the medical cannabis industry, in which 90% of what transpires as medical cannabis is largely flower or a concentrate of the flower, which is either smoked or vaporized. In India, however, we are entirely obsessed with everything outside of the flower, and I will get to that in my next slide, why that is. So I think that the first thing that we should touch upon is the elephant in the room, effectively the question that many times, whether laypersons, patients, or individuals looking to access cannabis medicine, or even healthcare practitioners, physicians, as the case may be, the first question that often comes up is cannabis legal? What is legal? What are the regulations pertaining to consuming cannabis? What are the regulations pertaining to overall the status of cannabis in the country? And we have in front of us, I suppose, this skull next to the NDPS, the infamous Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. In India, cannabis is registered under the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act, which was enacted in 1985. As some of you may be familiar, India being a founding member of the United Nations and also a signatory to what is called the Single Convention on Narcotics Drugs at the United Nations, which was enacted, I believe, in 1961 or 1962, all member countries have 25 years to ratify in their local legislations whatever our international obligations are. So my guess is that sometime in the early to mid-1980s, and we're often wont to perhaps badmouth our government or mandarins or bureaucrats as the case may be, but I suppose they realized that the time was running short and that we had to come up with narcotics legislations in line with what our international obligations under the UN were. And so effectively what we did was largely copy-paste what the single convention is and created what today in India, in our local legislation, is known as the NDPS Act. Interestingly, however, and I think due credit must be given to the mandarins who enacted or who came up or drafted and then submitted to Parliament for enacting this particular act, is that I think they recognize that a majority of the population in our country, especially those persons who 35 years back were living in rural areas, and I think it bears witness that still 65% of India's population still resides in rural or peri-urban areas effectively, is that for primary healthcare, most individuals were going to traditional medicine practitioners, which would be your Ayurveda practitioners, your Veds, your Hakims, individuals practicing classical systems of medicine such as Unani, Siddha, even Tibetan medicine as the case may be. And I think that the mandarins recognize that a majority of these classical systems of medicine often use cannabis in their formulations. These are crude formulations oftentimes. These are classical in the sense that we may not be familiar with them in an age of patches, pills, tablets, or injectables as the case may be. However, given that a majority of the patient population was likely accessing their primary physician who was a classical medicine practitioner, we created something very interesting, which this diagram in front of you kind of elucidates. Effectively, the NDPS Act outlaws the fruiting flower, the top of the plant, which is what we call bud in colloquial language. But the rest of the plant, the stem, the leaves, the stalk, the seeds, the roots, are entirely legal. Now, I don't know how it is possible to have one part of a plant which is legal and another part of a plant. I don't know, we might be sprouting something and, part of the sprout is legal, but the root might be illegal or whatever the case is. But effectively, legalese is something that Indians are excellent at, and we created this distinction in our national legislation. Everything except the bud, everything except the flower is legal. You obviously need the flower for germination. She'll get to that very briefly, but indeed, the THC is a compound which is present in different concentrations across the plant. And that really is what creates this caveat that enables us in India to actually have a medical cannabis or a cannabis medicine regime, as I prefer to call it, as opposed to medical cannabis, because we are not smoking, we are not vaporizing bud, the flower, which is common globally when it comes to maybe about now 15 jurisdictions that have a medical cannabis regime. So this is cannabis indica. I shall also, so there's, there is in taxonomy cannabis indica, cannabis sativa, cannabis ruderalis as well. I will speak on this briefly as well because the broad topic is inverting, let's say, some of the myths surrounding our understanding of the plant in particular. So in brief, in India, the cannabis plant is entirely legal, but the flower is illegal. Another way to look at it is that mango is entirely legal, except you can't eat it, right? I mean, you can grow as much mango as you want, but you can't eat any of it. Moving on. To answer your question, sir, cannabis, which is the scientific nomenclature, is effectively a plant, as it says here in the definition, which is a genus of medicinal, recreational, and fiber plants belonging to the family Cannabaceae. The reason why there is an misunderstanding of the fact that there is a multiplicity of cannabis is somewhat unfounded. And maybe I will draw an analogy once again to the mango plant. You might have different varieties of mango. You might have a chosa or a langda or a hafus or effectively growing in different parts of the country. They look different, they taste different. Some are sweeter, some are more tart, some fruit earlier in the season, some fruit later in the season, but they are all mango. In terms of what the species is, they're all mangoes, they're just varieties of mango. It is no different when it comes to the cannabis plant. Cannabis is the same in language as hemp. It is the same in language as, well, this is a Mexican term, but marijuana. It is the same as what in Sanskrit or in Hindi we say bhang or bhanga, effectively. So in language, there is no distinction. However, once again, human beings are rather ingenious, and we have created differences and distinctions in legalese. So one of the common misunderstandings, or one of the common, at least, tropes that goes out is that hemp is different to cannabis. In any literature, in the Oxford English Dictionary, or otherwise, if you look at it, hemp and cannabis are the same. Just like bhang and ganja are effectively the same, at least in language and in terms of our understanding, there is no difference. The reason why there is a misunderstanding around the fact that hemp and cannabis may be different is because in 2018 in the US, which often leads such efforts, there was a distinction made to decriminalize CBD. CBD is cannabidiol, which is one of over 160 unique compounds identified in the cannabis plant, specific to the cannabis plant, called cannabinoids. THC, that you asked, that somebody asked about, and CBD are perhaps two of the most commonly known of these compounds, but there are 150 plus other such compounds which we have also identified in the plant. We're yet to understand what their therapeutic or other applications may be. So coming back to the first myth in a certain sense, there is no difference in actuality, but in legality, there is a difference between cannabis and hemp, because in 2018, the US came out with something known as the Farm Bill, in which they defined hemp as the cannabis plant that has less than 0.3% THC. Now, there is no naturally growing cannabis that exists anywhere in the world which has less than 0.3% THC. So you can derive CBD, one of the compounds in the cannabis plant, but to do so in the US, you can only plant, in inverted commas, hemp. Hemp which has less than 0.3% THC. This effectively means that this is a genetically modified plant. It requires a certain amount of genetic modification for you to be able to have this artificial seed varietal, which you can then plant, and because it does not have THC, THC is the intoxicating compound. It is the compound that actually gets you high. So therefore, if you are cultivating hemp as per the US definition, which does not contain any THC, You can have plantation and you can extract CBD, and from that CBD you can make whatever various products, whether therapeutic, recreational, or in the wellness thread. It bears witness that in India, and Uttarakhand is often cited as perhaps a lead state locally. What Uttarakhand did in 2018 was, in short, in about a page and a half, copy-paste just the part of the US legislation and said that they're coming out with a cannabis cultivation policy. This is all well and good in terms of intention, but once again, the challenge is that there is no seed varietal that propagates in our country. Different seeds require different climatic conditions. The seeds that we find, the cannabis seeds, and there are scores, hundreds of different cannabis seeds that we find in the country as well, they present obviously higher than this artificial 0.3% threshold. And therefore, for you to have a cultivation policy pertaining to this artificial 0.3% threshold, you need access to genetically modified seeds. It's a bit silly because cannabis is endemic to our country. Between August to November, after the monsoons effectively, from Jammu and Kashmir all the way to Arunachal Pradesh, you have cannabis which propagates automatically. It is effectively a weed. It does not require pesticides or fertilizers, fungicides as the case may be. It is endemic to our country and in fact went from India or from South Asia to the rest of the world. However, because we're often prone to copy-pasting global legislation, Uttarakhand also did the same. And so we have an enabling policy, but if you go and try and plant a genetically modified seed that you have to firstly buy in euro or dollar prices, as opposed to just going to the local mandi and getting tens of kilos of seeds effectively, you will find that the yield of that particular seed variety is very limited. If you were, let's say, expecting, I'm just making this up, 10 kilos per hectare effectively of your plant, from your plantation, you might only get about a fourth of that. So it becomes very expensive to access a international genetically modified seed, and similarly the yields that you get on that cultivation are also much lower than what you would expect, making this an entirely commercially unviable proposition. Similarly, given that everything outside of the flower is legal in our country, in 2021, I believe, the FSSAI, the Food Regulatory Authority, came out with regulations which said that cannabis seeds, or hemp seeds, we can use the term interchangeably, are legal. Now, once again, I have a small property in the mountains in Uttarakhand, and we serve our guests bhang ki chutney. We take hemp seeds which grow in the local community and have been in the winter time in particular used by women as part of their breakfast meal to have hemp seeds, bhang chutney, and then go out to work the fields. And if you speak to the locals, they often say that, look, this is part of our traditional foods. We have used it, and in the winters we use it kyunki in Hindi they say garmahat deta hai. So they actually consume the seed, which is non-intoxicating, in a chutney format and consume it as a foodstuff. However, as per the government, it's only in 2021 that this is actually legally tenable to be sold at a grocery store or on Amazon or wherever else effectively. Now, once again, this points to the fact that we sometimes do not apply. Sometimes, like I said, our mandarins are very intelligent, in which they enable us to have obligations that we need to meet internationally while carving out an exception so that traditional medicine practitioners can continue to make medicines using the cannabis plant. But other times we end up with completely inane regulations which do not make sense in our national context. I believe that there was the question, sir, that you asked on what the difference or different types of these plants are. Now, once again, I point to, and some persons here who might come from a medical or even a biological or botanical field would be familiar with these two gentlemen who, in the 18th century, effectively came up with what we today call taxonomy. So Carl Linnaeus and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck are the two individuals who really put in a very significant effort to create what is the system of identification and classification of various plant types, and I believe even effectively the genus system of classification is what these two gentlemen are credited with. However, despite their fabulous effort in terms of systematizing and putting together in a certain compendium our understanding of all of the different types of plants that exist, we must bear in mind that these were individuals who were traveling in the colonial world, and when they came upon countries like India, which they had never previously visited, and came across all kinds of plants, substances, fruits, as the case may be, one gentleman came across a cannabis plant and said that, oh, well, it's slightly taller. And the other gentleman came across a plant which said, oh, it's slightly, thinner. One has got bushier leaves, one has got thinner leaves. And effectively, this is what led to the first schism in terms of a definitional classification of cannabis sativa and cannabis indica. One individual said that because there is a visual difference between these two plants, and I come back once again to mango. You might have a small mango that you can suckle, or you might have a large mango which you probably have to cut and eat, or whatever the case is, but they're both mango. However, these two gentlemen assumed, perhaps erroneously, at least from a scientific point of view, because phytochemically there is no difference between all of the different cannabis varieties. When we analyze them from a scientific front, they're all the one and the same. So, courtesy these two gentlemen, we ended up with this classification of cannabis as cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, but it really has no bearing in science as such. Over the past 50 odd years, as the global recreational cannabis regime, and I suppose cannabis has been consumed for thousands of years, whether medicinally or recreationally, but over the past 50 or 60 years, especially once again out west, there have been all kinds of supplemental myths, if I can put it that way, that have been added on to the distinction between these two principal or so-called two principal varieties of the cannabis plant. And, there are various out west bud tenders, who are effectively individuals working in a cannabis clinic or a cannabis shop, where just like a bartender works in a bar, a bud tender might talk about an indica versus sativa, indica having certain properties, sativa having certain properties. One might be sedative, one might be euphoric. None of this has any bearing in pharmacology. None of this has any bearing in medical science effectively. These are all sort of part of, I suppose you can call them, the cannabis culture, the stoner culture, whatever it is, but these are not things which are very relevant from a medicinal or a medical development point of view. Any of us who have traveled or are familiar, therefore, with CBD have probably come across all kinds of different form factors in which CBD is retailed today. You will probably find there to be balms, you will find there to be tinctures, you will find there to be bath bombs, you will find there to be candles infused with CBD. You often have honey being sold at 10 times the price of a regular jar of honey just because it has got CBD in it. And all of this is fine and fair from a marketing point of view, and I actually had this one hair cream which apparently contains CBD in it as well, and is branded as Wetflix and chill, So I suppose Netflix and chill is the common marketing, terminology, but Wetflix and chill. So, there's all kinds of mismarketing when it comes to CBD. And I suppose that this is largely courtesy of the fact that in 2018 in the US, they decriminalized or deregulated CBD. And therefore, that led to the propagation of all kinds of different form factors. However, none of these are particularly medicinal. I even have this pug out here with CBD oil. There is now CBD available for pets. From a medical lens, from an understanding of how CBD interacts with the body, whether a human or an animal body, animals have a very, very different sort of reaction when it comes to the interaction of these compounds in animals, and therefore there might be a certain threshold of care which is lacking currently globally when it comes to the CBD industry. In our understanding, and when I say in our understanding, persons who are looking at the cannabis plant and compounds found in the cannabis plant from a therapeutic angle, from a medicinal angle, from an understanding from their pharmacological potential, there are three principal things that we understand about CBD in particular, but also some of the other compounds like THC and various others. The first is that CBD is anxiolytic. So I'm moving away from the myths and facts to a little bit of the simple science, at least, or simple understanding of cannabis. The first thing that we know is that CBD is anxiolytic. In other sense, it is very, very beneficial in reducing anxiety. One of the most common, even self-medicated use cases is for anxiety management in particular. The other thing that we know from various global studies, and including studies that have been done in India and including by ourselves as well, is that it has anti-inflammatory properties. And the third thing is that CBD has very significant neuroprotective properties. I would like to add that THC, in fact, has even stronger anti-inflammatory property than CBD, but CBD is a very, very significant and powerful anti-inflammatory compound. Coming to pharmacology, and this is for some of the doctors that might be in the audience here today, what we're finding is that there is a very, very wide variety of potential use cases of cannabinoids, and in particular CBD. Some of the studies, these are studies that have been done by us in India at various clinical research organizations, and we're finding there to be some very, very significant initial data when it comes to the preclinical biology, the preclinical studies that we have done. The first slide in front of you is something which is looking at what the anti-inflammatory potential or anti-inflammatory activity of the cannabis compound is. And the important thing to understand is, if we go back to the slide previously, these are all form factors, but nobody really knows how much of a particular compound is in this. What is the right dosage? Or for that matter, if you eat, I don't know, a CBD gummy, does it have 5 mg? Does it have 50 mg? Does it have 500 mg of that particular compound? Because the drug standards and drug regulations do not apply, it's a little bit of a wild west. And you have all kinds of labeling happening, but you are not entirely certain about whether or not those labels are actually true to fact in terms of what's inside the plant. What we therefore are finding is that it is very important whenever you're manufacturing a new drug to really understand the specificity of the action of those compounds, and that requires a certain structured, clinical development route. So the first slide, for example, is showing you how these are in vitro models, these are at a lab level, what the anti-inflammatory action of CBD has been. And if you can see, this is in micrograms per ml, but what we find is that across what are called dose-response studies, it is not always that when you increase the dosage, you get a higher efficacy or you get a higher treatment outcome. It is very important for you to establish what the optimal dosage outcome is, both from a manufacturing efficiency point of view, but also from an efficacy point of view. You want to ensure the maximum benefit, maximum efficacy of a medicine when administering it to a patient. In the first slide, you will see that there is an equivalent efficacy of CBD, whether you're using 0.001 micrograms per ml or whether you're using 0.1 microgram per ml. And this is 100 times difference, which effectively means that there is a sweet spot. You need to identify what that sweet spot is. So if you're developing a particular medicine for anti-inflammatory action, that is the kind of analysis that is required. That is the kind of investigation which is required before you actually, take any of these medicines to human development, human clinical studies. We were also observing what the potential, wound healing properties of a CBD patch could be. Once again, you see that there is an optimal concentration of CBD that is required to achieve the maximum effect, which in this particular model was at a 10 microgram per ml. So if you increase that 2.5 times, you see the efficacy of this particular compound falls off a cliff effectively. Similarly, if you're looking at dermatological applications, in fact, we've been working on something which might be particularly relevant to the conference today here on anti-aging. We've been looking at a serum. We've in fact got a serum in lab where effectively it's, purportedly has very significant anti-aging properties. And we've observed that the collagen synthesis, in that particular formulation, and this is just the isolate CBD, we're looking at a polypharmacological approach when it comes to the drugs that we make, but specifically to CBD, we see that in the case of collagen synthesis, there is a linear increase. So as you increase the concentration of CBD, you see that there is a greater propagation of collagen. And collagen is obviously, as we are all aware, very, very important when it comes to cellular health. It is the building block in a certain sense of our cell. But if, let us say, instead of an anti-aging serum, you were looking to make a product that potentially has, that is a sunscreen, for example, in which you want to have a certain amount of UVB protection. The first thing to notice is that the same compound is presenting very, very different properties, but at different concentrations. So depending on what the use case is, you may be able to use the same compound, but have a very different action dependent on what it is that you are looking to target. So if it comes to, let's say, creating a product which is protective against the sun, effectively as a sunscreen, once again, you find that there is an optimal dosage of CBD which is required. Now, the reason we are pointing this out is because cannabis science and cannabis understanding, and cannabis pharmacology is still very nascent. There are perhaps, I would say, 5 or 6 organizations around the world who are really looking to push the frontier of what the basic understanding of cannabinoid science is and translate things from, let's say, a lab level, an academic level, to an actual product level. The reasons for this are manifold. One, nobody is asking anybody to do this. You are able to sell cannabis globally. It is perhaps today a $50 billion industry. And if the FDA doesn't come in, or if no regulator comes in asking you to subscribe to certain standards, then it's a bit of a Wild West and free for all. And maybe most people are interested in just making money. But We believe that the therapeutic potential of not just CBD, not just THC, but a multiplicity of other compounds that are found in this plant are very significant. And this presents an opportunity for us to really push our understanding of cannabis science and create drugs, create formulations which can really be beneficial, especially in targeting various pro-inflammatory conditions. And I think that various speakers yesterday and perhaps earlier in the day today as well have spoken about how inflammation is the real enemy. We have all kinds of different inflammations in the body, which we call by various names, but majoritarily, most or a large part of chronic ailments that we see to be very prevalent both in India but effectively around the world are in fact pro-inflammatory conditions. And what we're finding is that the anti-inflammatory properties of THC and CBD in particular are very significant. And this becomes relevant not because these are the only compounds that have an anti-inflammatory property. It becomes relevant because, one, these are naturally occurring compounds. These are natural product compound, natural product medicines that you can make. These are medicines that do not require a reliance on a global supply chain when it comes to API, when it comes to the raw material, the key starter materials. India is a fabulous drug manufacturing country. We make generics and we're able to create medicines to treat hundreds of millions or billions of people around the world at prices which are extremely affordable, unlike the case with proprietary Western medicine. But one of the key challenges, and I think if Mr. Amitabh Kant, who was here yesterday, would perhaps, given that he was also Secretary of the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion earlier, he would understand that a lot of what we are manufacturing is firstly importing the ingredients from China. 70-80% of all the ingredients that are used by the Indian drug manufacturing industry are imported and then re-exported, which means that there is a certain reliance on global supply chains. When it comes to natural product medicines, and especially cannabis, India has a unique opportunity to leverage this and create medicines which can be used to treat a multiplicity of different conditions without necessarily having to rely on global supply chains, which can be challenging in times of either macro events like COVID, where supply chains get disrupted, or for various geopolitical reasons. If, for example, tomorrow China decides to take a strategic action to stop supply of KSMs and API to India, the entire Indian generic manufacturing industry, which is rightly called the pharmacy of the world, will collapse overnight. So these are certain considerations that we have to keep in mind as we look to further investigational drug development using natural products, using natural compounds in India. And cannabis really is presenting, it seems like it's a panacea that it can really cure many different kinds of diseases. It is not. There are very specific use cases. So it isn't, something to treat anything and everything. But there is a sufficiently wide umbrella of therapeutic action, and that is what we're attempting to do in terms of the work on the ground in India. Well, not much, there are, obviously, sort of pathogens, and I suffered from swine flu last week. I don't believe that there is any compound, at least that we know of, in the cannabis plant that can potentially have antiviral action. Acute infection, but in chronic disease, there seems to be a use case for cannabis at a microdose. And that is what I shall come to in my next few slides. That there is potential for us to almost look at stable, standardized cannabinoid medicines as a tonic, as a supplement, as a prophylactic, or as an adjuvant to various other standard of care medicines or interventions that we often have to use when it comes to managing. And we've spoken about both medical and non-medical approaches to do so. But our hypothesis is, and we really need to establish the data for that, but so far so good, that cannabis could potentially be an adjunct therapy to a multiplicity of existing interventions that are available today. The one other reason where cannabis really shines is its safety profile. And I was speaking to another person in the audience here earlier. There have been no global studies when it comes to understanding what the safety of cannabis is. That's largely because, once again, nobody is really looking at cannabis medicine. Nobody from the drug pharmaceutical industry is looking at cannabis medicine because it's very hard to establish IP. Because it's a naturally occurring compound, you cannot claim that this is something unique which you have created, and therefore have a 20-year patent window in which you're able to charge tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, as the case may be, which end up creating what the global pharma industry today is. And I think various speakers before me, including yesterday, have spoken about the fact that for a lot of physicians globally, It's really a question of just pushing synthetic compounds, and that is it. But there is a reason behind that. I think that most people forget. The 10 most valuable pharmaceutical companies in the world have a combined market capitalization of $4.2 trillion as of December 2023. The entire market capitalization of the Indian economy is $4 trillion. The 10 largest drug companies in the world together are larger than the Indian economy. You have to understand the economic weight that that represents, and the reason, therefore, why natural product medicines oftentimes are unavailable, unaccepted, but really, once again, we feel that India has the potential to be able to establish the primacy of these natural product medicines and to be able to challenge, perhaps in some small ways, perhaps just in India, because obviously it is very, very challenging economically and commercially to be able to go against a behemoth like an Eli Lilly. I mean, people don't realize that an Eli Lilly, which is perhaps probably the most valuable pharmaceutical company today, is 4 times the size of Reliance Industries. And sometimes in India, we think that Reliance is anything and everything, but people forget that there are scores of pharma companies which are much larger than what the largest of the organizations in the country are today. But coming back to the safety of cannabis, which really is, I think, its star value. We conducted what are called acute dose and repeat dose safety studies. These are in animal models. Look, we are familiar globally that cannabis is consumed recreationally for millennia. And we are aware that, at least as far as I know and as far as there is any record, there is perhaps no fatal outcome thus far recorded of cannabis overconsumption. Yes, there are various adverse effects that are present in cannabis, but there is absolutely no fatality at least recorded, which is one of the measures of understanding the safety of a medicine. What we did in an animal model a year and a half back in India itself, because once again, there was nothing on PubMed, there was nothing on Lancet, there was nothing on even the WHO website except a small paragraph saying that CBD is safe. But what is the safety of CBD? Yes, there are certain standards, there are certain tests which are prescribed by the pharma industry. We said, let's do them. India has the capacity to conduct this clinical research. Let's do that. So for example, an acute safety model, we took 5,000 mg, which was the highest dosage administered to a rat model in rats. We took 5,000 mg of extract and intravenously injected those animals in that particular animal model. Of the 8 rats that were part of this study, there was not a single fatal outcome. Now, please appreciate, 5,000 mg per kilogram, that's 5 grams per kilogram. If you were to convert that to a healthy adult male, let us say of 70 kilos, would be the equivalent, and look, you can't exactly convert an animal model into a human model, but 5 grams per kilogram would convert to 350 grams for an average 70 kilo adult human. 350 grams of pure cannabis extract is the equivalent of about 35 kilos of cannabis, bhang, whatever you may want to call it. If at Holi anybody has ever consumed a bhang ka laddu, this would be the equivalent in one sitting of eating about 100 kgs of bhang laddu, which is obviously humanly impossible. But even if you did, it would not lead to your requiring any kind of ER intervention effectively. You might require a lot of support in various other ways, and my last slide I will talk about that, but you will definitely not require a visit to the emergency room. Again, it is important for us to establish this. This is basic science, but without this in place, it becomes very hard to be able to convince individuals about not just the efficacy, but importantly, the safety of any such medicines. Again, just for the doctors present in the room who might be interested in what the potential of cannabis in their clinical practice is. Cannabis is a complicated but very interesting compound, a very interesting plant, and the compounds found therein. One of the things is that cannabis compounds are, and THC and CBD in particular, are biphasic. But various other subcompounds are also biphasic, but specifically they are biphasic. We've already spoken about the biphasic action, which is that at one concentration, the drug or the particular molecule has effect X, and that at a different concentration, it has a varying effect. So what I spoke about earlier is that you require an understanding of what the optimal concentration is, what the optimal dosage is. The second thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes, these compounds also have a bidirectional effect. By bidirectional is meant that, For example, there are two conditions which are currently approved in the US by the Food and Drug Administration using cannabis medicine. One of them is specifically to manage the side effects of chemotherapy, which is nausea and vomiting, which are the two most prevalent effects of chemotherapy. Cannabis medicine is indicated by the US, officially approved by the US, to manage CINV. However, if you consume a large quantity of cannabis, you will all be familiar, at least personally perhaps, or recreationally as the case may be in India or around the world, that there can be a very high level of paranoia. Paranoia is one of the things which you often find people who consume potentially cannabis recreationally, they complain about paranoia, and you can get an attack effectively, right? So the same compound is actually medically approved to treat something, which can be, for example, anxiety, which can be stress management, but at the same time, it can lead to a very, very different effect. I think an even more relevant example can be in the case of THC, for example, hyperemesis syndrome. So one of the things which is well established is that high doses of THC can lead to uncontrollable vomiting. But at the same time, you're saying that, hey, if you're suffering from cancer and you have chemotherapy, you must use this compound to actually prevent nausea. So this is the bidirectionality of that same compound, and it is therefore very important to know what the right concentration, what the right dosage is. And again, on a lighter note, I suppose, I don't know if on Holi you've ever seen anybody just throwing up. You might oftentimes find that people do consume just a small amount of lassi or whatever it is, and they're just unable to stop, vomiting thereafter. That is effectively because they have overdosed on THC. What we are finding is that because there is still a long ways for us to go to be able to establish standardized doses of medicine for different patient populations, treating different indications, we see a very wide variety of effective dosage. In clinical practice, we are finding that patients are oftentimes responding to very low dosages, but there are cases in which we're finding patients responding to significantly higher dosages as well. And this is almost unseen in various other, let's say, drugs, that you have 100 times, sometimes 1,000 times difference in the dosage between what is proven effective for one individual as opposed to what is proven for another individual. Therefore, generally speaking, we often try and suggest that it is better to focus on very small dosages, and which is why the topic of this presentation is microdosing in particular. And by microdosing, I mean it, not in the sense that we understand when it comes to psychedelics or otherwise, but very specifically when it comes to dosage guidance of cannabinoid medicine. A few other studies I would like to point out to here. For example, on the right-hand side, this was an understanding of response of synthetic formulation of cannabis for pain management, pain perception. And once again, we saw that just 4 sprays led to the maximum effect, but as soon as you increase the number of sprays of this oromucosal spray, it led to a reduction in efficacy. Here we have a study pertaining to actually what is a minor compound found in the cannabis plant called CBDA. This was effectively looking at the antiemetic activity of CBDA. So to prevent, for example, nausea, to prevent, for example, vomiting. And here, as you can see, that it is a very small dosage, which is just 0.1 micrograms per kilogram, which had the highest response when it comes to its anti-vomiting, antiemetic activity. So generally, we advise clinicians to be open to adopting cannabis medicine, to also be careful, however, when it comes to dosing, to start patients on a very low dosage, and to titrate that dosage up to efficacy. I think a mantra which was established by by Ethan Russo, who is one of the global leading, let's say, researchers, pharmacologists looking at cannabis medicine in particular, is to start low, go slow, and we add to this, stay low. There is absolutely no need generally for you to increase your dosage on a very, very micro dose below the threshold of even any perceptual changes, much below the threshold of intoxication. We are finding there to be very, very significant clinical outcomes. However, if a patient does not respond for whatever reason, one can also fairly comfortably, over a period of, let's say, a week to 10 days, increase the dosage fractionally, but not be scared about increasing the dosage exponentially either. Oftentimes, you have to find what the optimal dosage, even for an individual, is, until such time as we have established standardized dosage protocols. Last thing, therefore, that I would like to point out is that globally, there are thousands of CBD companies, cannabis companies, as the case may be. You will find all kinds of formulations in the market which have various ratios, this, that, and the other. None of that is really relevant from a pharmacological point of view. It is very important to understand what the specific mechanism of action of any particular molecule is. It is important for us to establish what these, sort of clinical studies are, dose response, and various other studies that you'll be familiar with, before we can actually confidently adopt specific medicine. But as such time that we get there, and I think India really can leapfrog and be a global leader when it comes to cannabinoid medicine, cannabinoid science, but up until such point in time, these are some of the clinical guidance that we advise for physicians who are taking up cannabis medicine in their clinical practice. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.